November 7, 1943, dawned gray and hostile over the island of Bougainville, where a young Marine corporal named John George Fulcher clutched a rifle that would become legend. The weapon in his hands, a Springfield Model 1903 with a commercial, unearthly 8-power scope, had arrived via Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog just months before the war consumed the Pacific. His fellow Marines had laughed when they first saw it, this sporting rifle among military-issue weapons, calling it everything from the deer gun to Fulcher's toy. But in the jungle-choked mountains of the Solomon Islands, where Japanese snipers had turned every shadow into a potential grave, no one was laughing anymore. The morning air hung thick with moisture as Fulcher settled into position on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Piva Trail. Behind him, the 3rd Marine Division had been grinding through some of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific theater since landing on Bougainville 3 days earlier. The Japanese had transformed the island into a fortress of interlocking defensive positions, and their snipers trained in the art of patience and concealment had been picking off American troops with devastating efficiency. In the previous 72 hours alone, 17 Marines had fallen to unseen shooters who seemed to materialize from the very jungle itself. Fulcher's journey to this moment had begun in the hills of Virginia, where he had grown up hunting squirrels and rabbits with his grandfather's old rifle. Before Pearl Harbor thrust America into war, he had been a competitive marksman, spending weekends at shooting ranges and poring over equipment catalogs with the same intensity other young men reserved for baseball statistics. When he saw the unearthly scope advertised in the Sears catalog, a precision instrument promising accuracy at distances that seemed impossible, he had saved every penny from his job at the lumber mill until he could afford both the scope and a quality Springfield rifle to mount it on. The decision to bring his personal rifle to war had been controversial. Marine Corps regulations required standardized weapons, and Fulcher had spent weeks arguing with supply officers and company commanders before finally receiving grudging permission to carry his own equipment. The other scouts and snipers in his unit carried the Marine Corps issue Springfield with its standard iron sights, or, if they were lucky, the newer M1941 sniper rifle with its inferior 2.5-power Weaver scope. Fulcher's 8-power unearthly scope was an anomaly, a civilian intrusion into military uniformity, and it had made him the subject of endless ridicule during training. "You planning to hunt ducks or Japs with that thing?" his sergeant had asked during weapons inspection at Camp Pendleton. The laughter that followed had stung, but Fulcher had simply cleaned his rifle in silence, knowing that debate was pointless. The weapon would speak for itself when the moment came. According to historical accounts documented in military archives and later referenced in publications such as the Marine Corps Gazette, that moment arrived on Bougainville with the force of destiny. As Fulcher scanned the jungle canopy through his scope that November morning, he spotted movement that others would have missed entirely, the subtle shift of palm fronds against the natural pattern of wind. A Japanese sniper, concealed in a carefully constructed hide approximately 300 yards distant, was settling into position to fire on an American patrol moving below. Fulcher's finger found the trigger. His breath slowed. The jungle sounds faded. In that crystalline instant between heartbeats, between one moment and the next, the war contracted to a single point of focus. The rifle cracked, and history began its count. The first Japanese sniper fell from his perch like a broken marionette, tumbling through palm branches before hitting the jungle floor with a sound that never reached Fulcher's position. The American patrol below froze momentarily, weapons raised, searching for the threat they never saw. One of them, a lieutenant named Robert Hammond, later reported seeing sunlight glint off something in the Trisulcher's scope and understanding, in that instant, that someone was watching over them with extraordinary skill. Within 30 minutes, Fulcher had identified and eliminated a second sniper positioned nearly 400 yards to the northeast. This shot presented far greater difficulty as the target was partially concealed behind the thick trunk of a banyan tree, with only his rifle barrel and a portion of his right shoulder visible through the scope's lens. Fulcher waited, motionless as stone, understanding what his grandfather had taught him in those Virginia hills. Patience was the sniper's greatest weapon. When the Japanese soldier shifted slightly to acquire his own target, exposing his chest for less than 3 seconds, Fulcher fired. The enemy sniper's rifle clattered down through the branches, followed by its owner. News of the morning's work spread through the Marine positions with remarkable speed. By noon, Fulcher's company commander, Captain James Mitchell, had climbed to the rocky outcrop to see this controversial rifle for himself. Mitchell was a by-the-book officer from Massachusetts who had initially opposed Fulcher's request to bring personal equipment into combat. He arrived expecting to deliver a reprimand about unauthorized engagement or wasted ammunition. The Marine Corps was nothing if not obsessed with conserving resources. Instead, Mitchell found himself examining 2 confirmed kills at distances that exceeded standard Marine sniper doctrine. The captain lifted Fulcher's rifle, testing its weight and balance. The unearthly scope, with its distinctive long tube and external adjustment knobs, looked strange mounted on the familiar Springfield action. Mitchell peered through the glass and sucked in his breath sharply. The magnification was extraordinary, revealing details in the jungle that seemed impossible to see with naked eyes or standard equipment. "How much did this setup cost you, Corporal?" Mitchell asked, lowering the rifle carefully. $63.50 for the scope, Sir Fulcher replied. Another $42 for the rifle from a dealer in Richmond. Saved for 8 months to afford it. Mitchell did the mathematics in his head. The official Marine Corps sniper rifle package cost the government approximately $180. Fulcher had assembled a superior weapon for less than 60% of that price, using his own money and initiative. The captain felt a mixture of admiration and embarrassment. Admiration for the young Marine's resourcefulness. Embarrassment that a catalog order had outperformed military procurement. The afternoon brought no respite in the fighting. Japanese forces launched a counterattack against the Marine perimeter near the Piva airstrip, and Fulcher relocated to support a company of riflemen pinned down by enemy fire. From a new position atop a coral outcropping, he began systematically eliminating Japanese machine gun crews and mortar teams. The 8-power magnification allowed him to spot targets that other snipers couldn't detect, while the unertl scope's precise adjustments enabled accurate shots at ranges exceeding 600 yards. By 1700 hours, as the tropical sun began its rapid descent toward the horizon, Fulcher had recorded 5 confirmed kills. The Marines he protected began calling him the catalog sniper and Sears' deadly roebuck, though always with respect rather than mockery. Officers who had questioned his unorthodox weapon now sought his position on their maps, wanting to know where he would be watching over them during the next operation. That evening, gathered around a weak fire in their defensive position, Fulcher's fellow Marines examined his rifle with newfound reverence. The weapon had become a topic of intense curiosity, and Fulcher found himself explaining the technical details to men who had never considered that civilian equipment might sometimes surpass military issue. The Springfield action was stronger than the newer semi-automatic rifles, he explained, and the bolt-action design was inherently more accurate for precision shooting. The unertl scope, built for competitive target shooting, offered clarity and magnification that no military scope could match. Sergeant Thomas Blake, who had led the mockery during training, ran his finger along the scope's adjustment knobs. "I owe you an apology, Fulcher," he said quietly. "I called this thing a toy." Fulcher shrugged, cleaning carbon from the rifle's chamber with a patch of cloth. "It's just a tool, Sergeant, right tool for the job, that's all." But it was more than that, and everyone present knew it. In a war increasingly dominated by industrial production and standardization, one Marine with a catalog rifle had proven that individual initiative and skill still mattered. November 8th arrived with rain that turned the jungle into a steaming green hell. Water dripped from every leaf, filled every foxhole, and made footing treacherous on the volcanic soil that composed Bougainville's interior. Visibility decreased to mere yards in places where fog settled into the valleys, and conventional military wisdom suggested that sniping would be impossible under such conditions. But Fulcher understood what many didn't train, and fog affected everyone equally, and the Japanese snipers who had terrorized the Marines would likely assume the Americans would abandon their watching positions during the storm. They would be wrong. Fulcher moved through the downpour before dawn, selecting a new position on the northern slope of a ridge that overlooked a crucial supply route the Japanese had been using to reinforce their positions. He had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs the previous evening, memorizing terrain features and identifying likely concealment points where enemy snipers might establish themselves. The rain would muffle sound, making it harder for the enemy to locate him after he fired, but it also meant his scope lens would require constant attention to prevent water droplets from obscuring his vision. He had come prepared, using a piece of canvas cut from an abandoned shelter half to create a makeshift hood over the scope. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the worst of the rain off the lens while still allowing him to scan the jungle effectively. As gray dawn light filtered through the clouds, Fulcher settled into the familiar routine of watching and waiting. The first kill of the day came at 0-7-15 hours, when a Japanese patrol moved down the trail below his position. They traveled in loose formation, weapons at ready, clearly experienced jungle fighters who understood the importance of dispersion in cover. But training and experience couldn't protect them from a threat they never imagined existed in such weather. Fulcher selected the patrol leader, a sergeant identifiable by his sword and the way the other soldiers deferred to his hand signals. The shot traveled 280 yards through rain and mist before finding its target. The patrol scattered immediately, diving for cover with impressive speed. But Fulcher had anticipated this reaction, and his bolt was already cycling, chambering a fresh round. He tracked a soldier who had taken cover behind a fallen log and fired the instant the man raised his head to locate the shooter. The remaining patrol members retreated in disorder, dragging one wounded comrade but leaving 2 bodies behind. What Fulcher didn't know was that his activities had not gone unnoticed by Japanese command. A skilled enemy sniper named Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto had been tracking American sniper positions for 3 days, compiling information about their habits and locations. Yamamoto was a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines, with 23 confirmed kills to his record. He had noticed the unusual accuracy of recent American sniper fire and correctly deduced that a particularly dangerous marksman was operating in the sector. Now, using the bodies of the fallen patrol as bait, Yamamoto established his own position, approximately 500 yards from where he estimated the American sniper must be hiding. He carried an Arisaka Type 97 sniper rifle with a 4-power telescopic sight inferior to Fulcher's equipment in magnification, but sufficient for Yamamoto's purposes. The Japanese sniper understood that patience and psychology were more important than technology. The American would eventually reveal himself, either by firing again or by attempting to relocate. When that moment came, Yamamoto would be ready. Hours passed. The rain continued its relentless assault. Fulcher remained motionless in his position, aware that something felt wrong but unable to identify the specific threat. His instincts, honed by years of hunting and months of combat, warned him that he was being observed. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, the feeling of hostile eyes searching for him through the jungle murk. At 1300 hours, a Marine squad advanced down the trail toward the area where the Japanese bodies lay. Fulcher watched through his scope, ready to provide covering fire if needed. The Marines approached cautiously, weapons sweeping the jungle, aware that the dead soldiers might be part of a larger trap. One young private, barely old enough to shave, moved slightly ahead of his squadmates, apparently eager to prove his courage. Fulcher saw the danger before anyone else did. A Japanese sniper, not Yamamoto, but another shooter positioned closer to the trail, was tracking the young Marine through his sights. Fulcher could see the subtle movement of palm fronds where the enemy had concealed himself, approximately 300 yards distant. He made his decision instantly, prioritizing the American life over his own concealment. The Springfield cracked, and the Japanese sniper tumbled from his perch. But in firing, Fulcher had revealed his position to Yamamoto, who had been watching for exactly such a moment. The Japanese sniper's response was immediate and professional. His bullet struck the rocks inches from Fulcher's head, spraying coral fragments that cut his cheek and left his ears ringing from the near miss. Fulcher rolled sideways, abandoning his carefully prepared position and scrambling for new cover behind a thick-trunked tree. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear but from the sudden spike of adrenaline that combat brings. He had been careless, staying too long in one position, and had nearly paid the ultimate price. Now the situation had transformed from hunter to hunted, and somewhere in the rain-soaked jungle, a skilled enemy was searching for another shot. The wound on Fulcher's cheek bled steadily, mixing with rain and sweat as he pressed himself against the tree trunk. He forced himself to breathe slowly, fighting the instinct to panic that follows a near-death experience. The enemy sniper, clearly a professional rather than the average Japanese infantryman, had missed by mere inches, which meant two things. First, the shooter was extremely skilled to have come so close at what must have been at least 400 yards through rain and mist. Second, the shooter now knew Fulcher's approximate position and would be adjusting for a follow-up shot. Fulcher understood the mathematics of his situation with crystal clarity. If he moved carelessly, the enemy would see him and fire. If he remained stationary, the enemy would eventually find an angle around his cover. His only advantage was the superior magnification of his unertl scope, which might allow him to spot the Japanese sniper before being spotted in return. But to use that advantage, he needed to expose himself to observation, creating a deadly paradox that had killed countless snipers throughout history. He wiped blood and rain from his face with the back of his hand, then carefully removed his helmet and placed it on the end of a broken branch. It was an old trick, almost insultingly simple, but sometimes the old tricks worked because they exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology. He slowly raised the helmet above the rocks that formed his partial cover, moving it with subtle irregularity to simulate natural head movement. The response was immediate. A bullet struck the helmet with a sharp metallic clang, punching through the steel and sending it spinning from the branch. Fulcher had been watching for the muzzle flash, and the 8-power magnification of his scope revealed what he needed to know: a small puff of smoke and movement approximately 450 yards to his northeast, partially concealed within a tangle of jungle vines and behind the massive root system of a strangler fig. But seeing the enemy position wasn't enough. The Japanese sniper was well concealed, with only the smallest gaps in the vegetation offering potential shooting lanes. Fulcher would need to wait for movement, for that critical instant when the enemy shifted position or adjusted his aim. In the meantime, the situation remained a deadly stalemate, two professional hunters locked in a battle of patience and nerve. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The rain began to slacken slightly, though the jungle remained shrouded in mist and shadow. Fulcher's legs cramped from maintaining his position, but he ignored the discomfort. Pain was temporary. Mistakes were permanent. He kept his scope trained on the area where he had seen the muzzle flash, watching for the slightest irregularity in the pattern of leaves and vines. At 1400 hours, his patience was rewarded. The Japanese sniper made a minute adjustment to his position. shifting perhaps 6 inches to his left to acquire a better angle around Fulcher's cover. It was a tiny movement, barely perceptible even through the 8-power magnification, but it revealed what Fulcher needed: a small section of the enemy's torso, dark against the lighter background of the strangler fig's roots. Fulcher's crosshairs settled on the target. He compensated for distance, for the slight breeze that had picked up as the rain decreased, for the downward angle of his shot. His finger took up tension on the trigger, that delicate balance between action and restraint that separates good shooters from excellent ones. He exhaled slowly, let his heartbeat settle, and in the space between one pulse and the next, he fired. The bullet's flight time at 450 yards seemed eternal, though in reality it was barely half a second. Through his scope, Fulcher saw the impact, the sudden jerk of the target, the spray of bark and fragments from the strangler fig roots, the unmistakable stillness that follows a killing shot. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto, veteran of 3 campaigns and 23 confirmed kills, died without knowing exactly where his opponent had been hiding. Fulcher didn't move immediately. He remained in position for another hour, watching for additional threats, waiting to see if other Japanese soldiers would investigate the sound of gunfire. When no one appeared, he carefully made his way down from his position, circling wide to approach the enemy sniper's hide from an unexpected angle. He found Yamamoto's body precisely where his scope had shown it, the Arisaka rifle still gripped in dead hands. Examining the Japanese sniper's position, Fulcher felt a strange mixture of respect and sorrow. The hide had been expertly constructed, the shooting lane carefully selected. The soldier had been skilled and brave, fighting for his country with the same dedication Fulcher brought to his own cause. War reduced such men to statistics and body counts. But Fulcher never forgot that each enemy he killed had been a person with family, hopes, and dreams. He removed Yamamoto's identification tags and rifle scope items that intelligence officers would want to examine him, made his way back toward Marine lines. As he walked through the rain-soaked jungle, Fulcher thought about the duel that had just concluded, about how close he had come to losing, about how chance and preparation had combined to determine which sniper would return to his lines and which would remain forever in the jungle. By the time he reached the Marine perimeter, darkness was falling, and his tally for the day stood at 4 confirmed kills. 7 total in 2 days. But the count meant less to him than the survival of the young private, whose life he had saved by exposing his position. November 9th brought clearer weather to Bougainville, and with the improved visibility came renewed intensity in the fighting. The Japanese had reinforced their positions overnight, bringing in fresh troops from the interior of the island. American aerial reconnaissance reported significant enemy movement toward the Marine perimeter, suggesting a major counterattack was imminent. Every rifle would be needed in the coming battle, including the one that had arrived via catalog from a more innocent time. Fulcher received new orders at dawn: establish an observation position overlooking the approaches to Hill 260, a crucial terrain feature that dominated the surrounding area. Intelligence suggested the Japanese would concentrate their attack on this hill, attempting to break through Marine defenses and reach the vital airstrip being constructed near the coast. If they succeeded, months of planning and hundreds of casualties would be rendered meaningless. He selected his position with care, choosing a spot on a coral outcropping that offered excellent fields of fire while providing reasonable protection from counter-battery fire. The location was exposed; anyone with binoculars would be able to spot him once he began shooting, but the tactical advantages outweighed the personal risk. From this position, Fulcher could cover nearly 500 yards of approach terrain, a killing zone that Japanese attackers would have to cross to reach Marine lines. The attack began at 0000 hours with a fierce artillery barrage that churned the jungle into a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. Marines huddled in their foxholes while shells screamed overhead, and Fulcher pressed himself against the coral, feeling the earth shake with each impact. When the barrage finally lifted, a deadly silence fell over the battlefield, that pregnant pause before infantry emerges from concealment to begin the dangerous work of assault. They came in waves, Japanese soldiers advancing in small groups with professional discipline. Officers led from the front, swords raised, shouting encouragement to their men. Machine guns chattered from Marine positions, and mortar rounds began falling among the attacking forces. But still, they came forward with impressive determination. This was the Japanese army that had conquered much of Asia, soldiers trained to accept death as part of their duty, and they would not be easily stopped. Fulcher began his methodical work. Through his scope, individual soldiers became distinct human beings for brief moments before his finger pressed the trigger and they became casualties. He prioritized targets according to threat level: first, the officers and non-commissioned officers whose leadership held units together, then machine gun crews and soldiers carrying anti-tank weapons that might threaten Marine armored support. Each shot required calculation: distance, wind, the target's movement, the angle of terrain. At 1000 hours, he spotted a Japanese sniper attempting to establish position in a shell crater approximately 350 yards distant. The enemy soldier was well trained, moving with the kind of caution that indicated experience. He carried an Arisaka rifle with a telescopic sight and was scanning the Marine lines methodically, searching for priority targets. Fulcher settled his crosshairs on the man's chest and fired. The Japanese sniper collapsed into the crater, never having seen the threat that killed him. A Marine runner arrived at Fulcher's position during a lull in the fighting, bringing water and ammunition. The young Corporal No, more than 19 years old, stared at the Springfield with its distinctive scope, with something approaching awe. "Sir, they're saying you've killed 10 Japs in 3 days. Is that true?" "8 confirmed," Fulcher replied, not looking away from his scope. "Maybe 10 total if you count probables. And I'm not an officer, so don't call me sir." "Sorry, Corp, I mean Fulcher. It's just, everyone's talking about you, about the rifle you bought from a catalog. Guys are saying it's the best sniper rifle in the Pacific." Fulcher allowed himself a slight smile. "It's a good rifle. But mostly it's just about taking time to aim properly. Your rifle's probably just as accurate if you know how to use it." This was partially true and partially false. The unertl scope provided significant advantages that no amount of skill could overcome with iron sights. But Fulcher had never been comfortable with praise or attention. He preferred to let the work speak for itself, to focus on the immediate task rather than any larger reputation building around his actions. The afternoon brought a second Japanese assault, this one even more determined than the morning attack. Enemy soldiers advanced through their own artillery fire in some sectors, accepting casualties from friendly explosions in order to close with Marine positions more quickly. It was a tactic born of desperation, suggesting that Japanese commanders understood they were losing the battle for Bougainville and were willing to spend lives freely to achieve any tactical success. Fulcher worked his rifle until the barrel grew hot enough to burn skin, until his shoulder ached from recoil and his eyes strained from hours of peering through the scope. He lost count of shots fired, focusing instead on the rhythm of loading, aiming, firing, and cycling the bolt. The Springfield's action worked smoothly, despite the heat and humidity, a testament to both its design and Fulcher's meticulous maintenance habits. By 1700 hours, when the Japanese finally withdrew, leaving hundreds of bodies scattered across the approach to Hill 26, Fulcher had fired 63 rounds and recorded 4 more confirmed kills. His total now stood at 12 enemy soldiers killed in 4 days, though the exact number would remain disputed in official records due to the chaos of battle making confirmation difficult. What couldn't be disputed was the psychological impact of his presence. Japanese prisoners captured after the battle reported that their officers had warned about an American sniper with extraordinary accuracy who was killing soldiers at distances previously thought safe. The morning of November 10th found Fulcher struggling with exhaustion that went beyond the physical. 4 consecutive days of combat had drained something essential from his reserves, not courage or skill, but the mental clarity required for precision shooting. His hands trembled slightly as he cleaned his rifle, a tremor born from adrenaline fatigue rather than fear. The Springfield had performed flawlessly, but its operator was beginning to fray around the edges. Captain Mitchell appeared at Fulcher's fighting position carrying 2 canteens of coffee, a luxury in the front lines. He sat down beside the young sniper without speaking, handing over one canteen and drinking from the other. They watched the morning mist burn off the jungle in silence. 2 men who had learned that sometimes words were inadequate to the moment. "I'm pulling you off the line for 24 hours, Mitchell finally said. "You've been forward for 4 straight days, and you're starting to look like death warmed over." Fulcher started to protest, but Mitchell raised a hand. "That's not a request, Corporal. We need you sharp, not exhausted. A tired sniper is a dead sniper, and we've invested too much in keeping you alive to waste it now. There's a supply tent about a half-mile back with actual cots. Sleep, eat something that didn't come from a can, and clean that rifle properly. Tomorrow, you can go back to being a hero." The word hero made Fulcher uncomfortable, but he recognized the wisdom in Mitchell's order. He had been operating on caffeine, adrenaline, and stubbornness for days, and the inevitable crash was approaching. Better to rest now under controlled circumstances than collapse at a critical moment. He gathered his equipment and made the walk back to the supply area, feeling every one of his 23 years weighing on him like decades. The supply tent was a revelation. Someone had erected actual folding cots with mosquito netting, and there were wooden crates to sit on instead of muddy ground. A field kitchen had been established nearby, producing hot food that bore some resemblance to actual meals rather than the cold rations that sustained frontline troops. Fulcher ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind still processing the events of the past 4 days. A lieutenant from intelligence found him after he had eaten. The officer introduced himself as Robert Keegan, a former professor of military history from Cornell University who had been drafted into service despite his age and academic background. Keegan carried a notebook and wore glasses that seemed perpetually fogged from the humidity. "Corporal Fulcher, I need to document your equipment and methodology for the official record. The Marine Corps is very interested in understanding how you've achieved such remarkable results with non-standard equipment." Keegan sat on an adjacent crate, pencil poised over his notebook. Let's start with the rifle itself. You purchased it through a commercial catalog, correct? Fulcher nodded, beginning what would become a detailed technical discussion of the Springfield's modifications, the unearthed scope's specifications, and the ammunition selection process he had developed through experimentation. Keegan took notes with academic precision, occasionally asking questions that revealed genuine understanding of ballistics and marksmanship principles. What emerged from this interviewer filed in Marine Corps archives and referenced in subsequent training materials was a comprehensive analysis of how individual initiative could sometimes outperform institutional procurement. Fulcher's rifle cost $105.50 of his own money. The official Marine Corps sniper package cost approximately $180 and provided inferior performance at ranges beyond 300 yards. The implications were obvious and somewhat embarrassing to military procurement officers. The scope is the key component, Fulcher explained, running his hand along the unearthed tube. 8-power magnification means I can see details that other snipers miss entirely. I can identify whether a soldier is an officer or enlisted man at 400 yards. I can see which way his rifle is pointed, whether he's alert or fatigued. That information decides who I shoot first and when I shoot them. Keegan scribbled notes furiously. And the accuracy, how much of that is the equipment versus the shooter? Fulcher considered the question carefully. At 100 yards, equipment doesn't matter much. A good shooter with iron sights is almost as accurate as someone with a scope. But at 300 yards and beyond, the scope becomes critical. I can make shots at 450 yards, that would be nearly impossible with standard sights. So I'd say the equipment gives me about 40% advantage at long range, and skill provides the rest. The interview continued for nearly 2 hours, covering topics ranging from bullet selection to breathing techniques to the psychological aspects of counter-sniper work. Keegan's questions were intelligent and probing, suggesting he understood that Fulcher's success involved more than just good equipment. There was an art to sniping that transcended technical specifications and intuitive understanding of terrain, weather, light, and human behavior that couldn't be fully captured in written doctrine. As evening approached, Fulcher finally collapsed onto one of the cots, surrendering to exhaustion that had been held at bay for days. He slept 14 hours straight, through artillery fire and aircraft noise and the general chaos of a military camp in wartime. When he awoke, the sun was high, and someone had placed a fresh uniform beside his cot, along with a note from Captain Mitchell. Your rifle has been cleaned and is at Armory Tent. Report to Company CP at 1400 hours. Fulcher retrieved his Springfield from the armory, where a weapons sergeant had indeed cleaned it thoroughly, though not quite to Fulcher's exacting standards. He spent 30 minutes disassembling, inspecting, and reassembling the rifle, checking headspace and bore condition, ensuring the scope mounting remained true. A rifle was only as reliable as its maintenance, and Fulcher trusted no one but himself with this particular weapon. At company command post, Captain Mitchell briefed him on a new assignment. November 11th, a date that held special significance as the anniversary of the armistice that ended the First World War. Dawned with unusual clarity over Bougainville. The skies had finally cleared after days of rain, and visibility extended for miles across the jungle canopy. It was ideal weather for sniping, which meant it was equally ideal for being sniped. The Japanese would be taking advantage of the conditions just as aggressively as the Americans. Captain Mitchell's briefing had been succinct. Marine reconnaissance patrols had identified a Japanese observation post on Hill 312, approximately 2 miles behind enemy lines. The observers were directing artillery fire against American positions with devastating accuracy, and several attempts to eliminate them with counter-battery fire had failed. The observation post needed to be destroyed before the next major American offensive, scheduled to begin in 48 hours. We're sending a scout sniper team, Mitchell had explained, pointing to aerial photographs spread across a makeshift table. You'll be accompanied by Sergeant Blake and 2 riflemen for security. Infiltrate under cover of darkness, eliminate the observers, and extract before dawn. Simple in concept, difficult in execution. Fulcher studied the photographs carefully, memorizing terrain features and potential approach routes. The observation post appeared to be a well-constructed position, likely reinforced with logs and coral, providing the occupants with significant protection. A direct assault would be suicidal. But a precision shot from an unexpected angle might succeed where conventional tactics had failed. Sergeant Thomas Blake, the same sergeant who had once mocked Fulcher's catalog, rifle, would lead the patrol. Blake had evolved from skeptic to believer after witnessing Fulcher's performance over the past week, and he now approached the mission with confidence, born from working alongside someone he trusted absolutely. The 2 riflemen, Privates Daniel McCarthy and James Rodriguez, were experienced scouts who understood the critical importance of silence and stealth in enemy territory. They departed the marine perimeter at 2200 hours, moving through darkness with practiced caution. The jungle at night was a different world from the daytime battlefield. sounds amplified, distances distorted, every shadow potentially concealing an enemy soldier. They traveled slowly, covering perhaps a quarter mile per hour, pausing frequently to listen for Japanese patrols or defensive positions. By 0300 hours, they had reached a position approximately 800 yards from the target. Closer approach was impossible. The Japanese had cleared fields of fire around their observation post, creating open ground that would expose anyone attempting to advance further. Fulcher studied the enemy position through his scope, using the faint starlight to discern details that would have been invisible to unaided eyes. The observation post housed at least 3 soldiers, possibly more. He could see their silhouettes moving against the sky when they stood to scan the American lines through their own binoculars. The distance was extreme. Even for Fulcher's equipment, 800 yards represented the outer edge of what was possible with a Springfield rifle and the ammunition he carried. At such range, bullet drop exceeded 30 feet, and even slight wind variations could push the shot several feet off target. Blake whispered in his ear, "Can you make the shot?" Fulcher didn't answer immediately. Honesty required acknowledging the difficulty. At 800 yards, he was no longer conducting precision sniping, but rather long-range shooting that involved as much luck as skill. The probability of a first-round hit was perhaps 30% under ideal conditions, but they had time, perhaps 2 hours before dawn, forced them to withdraw, and he carried enough ammunition for multiple attempts. "I can hit the position," he finally said. "Whether I hit a person or just the sandbags depends on timing and luck. But if I miss, they'll know we're here and call for reinforcements." "Then don't miss," Blake replied, the ghost of a smile in his voice. Fulcher settled into his shooting position, making minute adjustments to his body alignment until everything felt correct. He ranged the target carefully, using known dimensions of the structure to calculate distance. 820 yards, he decided, maybe 830 depending on whether his reference point was the front or rear of the position. He adjusted his scope accordingly, dialing an elevation that would arc the bullet high over the intervening terrain. Wind was the critical unknown. At ground level, the air was nearly still, but at mid-trajectory perhaps 200 feet above the jungle floor crosswinds might be pushing left or right. He watched palm fronds at various heights, looking for patterns in their movement. A gentle breeze from the east, he concluded, perhaps 5 miles per hour. He adjusted his aim 2 feet left of target to compensate. At 0-4-15 hours, one of the Japanese observers stood fully upright, stretching after hours in a cramped position. Fulcher's crosshairs settled on the man's chest. He controlled his breathing, exhaled slowly, and let his finger take up tension on the trigger. The Springfield roared, shattering the pre-dawn quiet. Through his scope, Fulcher watched the bullets impactant on the standing soldier, but on the sandbag wall 2 feet to the right. The observer dropped from sight, either diving for cover or hit by fragments. Fulcher cursed silently and worked the bolt, chambering another round. He had perhaps 10 seconds before the Japanese recovered from their surprise and began searching for his position. The second shot came 8 seconds later. This time, Fulcher compensated for the wind variation he'd observed from the first impact. A different soldier rose partially above the parapet, attempting to locate the source of the incoming fire. The bullet caught him in the upper chest, and he collapsed backward. Through the scope, Fulcher saw other figures moving frantically inside the observation post. Now aware, they were under accurate fire from an impossible distance. "Hit," Blake confirmed quietly, watching through binoculars. "They're evacuating the position." 2 more Japanese soldiers emerged from the rear of the observation post, running toward a communication trench that would take them to safety. Fulcher tracked the lead runner, compensated for movement and distance, and fired. Missed. A bullet impacted dirt 5 feet behind the running figure. He cycled the bolt smoothly, muscle memory taking over, and fired again. This time the soldier stumbled and fell, though whether from a hit or simply losing his footing in panic was impossible to determine. The observation post fell silent. No more movement was visible through the scope. Fulcher waited, watching for any indication that the position remained occupied. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, and they needed to withdraw before full daylight exposed them. "That's it," Blake decided. "Mission accomplished. Let's move." They retraced their route through the jungle, moving faster now that they could partially see their surroundings. Japanese patrols would soon be searching for them, and speed had become more important than stealth. By 0600 hours they had crossed back into American lines, exhausted but successful. The observation post that had been directing deadly accurate artillery fire against Marine positions would direct no more. Captain Mitchell met them at the perimeter, relief evident on his face. "Intelligence confirms the Japanese artillery has stopped targeting our positions. Whatever you did up there, it worked." Fulcher simply nodded, too tired for detailed explanations. The mission had required 4 shots at 800+ yards a distance he had never attempted before under combat conditions. 2 confirmed hits out of 4 shots at that range represented exceptional shooting. though Fulcher characteristically focused on the 2 misses rather than the 2 hits. That afternoon, as he cleaned his rifle once again, Sergeant Blake sat down beside him. The sergeant pulled out a worn notebook and a pencil, marking something down before speaking. That's 11 confirmed kills in 4 days. Fulcher: 12 if we count the one from this morning's mission. 13 if intelligence verifies both targets from the observation post were killed rather than just wounded. Fulcher paused in his cleaning, a patch halfway through the barrel. I'm not keeping score, Sergeant, I know you're not, but the Corps is. They're talking about putting you in for a Silver Star, maybe a Navy Cross, if the observation post mission gets verified as critical to the offensive. The thought of medals and recognition made Fulcher deeply uncomfortable. He had done his job, nothing more. Thousands of Marines were fighting and dying on Bougainville, and most of them would receive no recognition beyond a brief mention in casualty reports. I'd rather they just let me keep doing the work, he said finally. Blake smiled. That's exactly what Mitchell said you'd say. But here's the thing, your work is changing how the Corps thinks about sniper equipment. There's already talk about procuring better scopes for designated marksmen. Your catalog rifle is going to influence doctrine for years to come. This prospect interested Fulcher more than any medal. If his experience could help other Marines survive and succeed, then the ridicule he'd endured during training would have been worthwhile. The Springfield with its unearthed scope had proven that commercial equipment, selected by knowledgeable individuals, could sometimes outperform military-issue weapons chosen by committee and constrained by budgets. As evening fell over Bougainville, Fulcher found himself thinking about the catalog he'd studied so carefully back in Virginia, before Pearl Harbor transformed the world. The Sears, Roebuck, and Company catalog had been a window into a peaceful world of consumer choices and leisure pursuits, hunting for sport rather than survival, target shooting for recreation rather than war. That world seemed impossibly distant now, separated by not just miles but by fundamental changes in how he understood human nature and mortality. Yet that catalog had also given him the tools to survive and protect others in this new, violent world. The irony wasn't lost on him. Instruments designed for sport had become instruments of war, and had proven themselves more effective than weapons designed specifically for killing. There was a lesson there, though Fulcher wasn't sure exactly what it was. November 12th brought an unexpected visitor to Fulcher's position, a war correspondent named Edward R. Sullivan from the Associated Press. Sullivan had been covering the Pacific Theater since Guadalcanal, and he had developed a reputation for finding the human stories behind the casualty statistics. He was a short man with penetrating eyes and a notebook that seemed permanently attached to his right hand. Corporal Fulcher, Sullivan began, settling onto a supply crate without waiting for invitation. I'm told you're the Marine who bought his sniper rifle from a catalog and has been killing Japanese soldiers at impossible distances. That true? Or is this another piece of war mythology? Fulcher eyed the correspondent with suspicion. He had no interest in publicity or in seeing his name in newspapers back home. I'm just doing my job, sir, same as every other Marine on this island. Sullivan smiled, recognizing evasion when he heard it. I've already spoken with Captain Mitchell and Lieutenant Keegan. They've confirmed 11 verified kills in 4 days, possibly more. They've shown me your rifle and explained the technical advantages of your scope. What I want to know is why you brought your own equipment to war when the Marine Corps provides weapons to every soldier. The question touched on something Fulcher had been thinking about during quiet moments between missions. He considered his words carefully before responding. I grew up hunting, Mr. Sullivan. My grandfather taught me that your rifle is your responsibility, you maintain it. You know its quirks, you trust it because you've put in the time to understand it completely. When the war started, I knew I'd be going into combat eventually. I wanted a rifle I could trust with my life, and that meant a rifle I'd selected and prepared myself. Sullivan scribbled notes rapidly. But surely the Marine Corps has good equipment. They do, Fulcher acknowledged. The standard issue Springfield is an excellent rifle, but the scopes they provide are adequate at best, low magnification, limited adjustments, designed more for cost efficiency than optimal performance. I wanted the best possible tool for the job, and I was willing to pay for it myself. How much did your setup cost? $105.50. Total. The scope was $63.50 from Sears. The rifle was another $42 from a dealer in Virginia. Saved for 8 months while working at a lumber mill to afford it. Sullivan did the mathematics in his head, calculating what $105 represented to a young man working at a lumber mill in 1941. It was a significant sacrifice. Multiple weeks of wages invested in equipment he might never need if the war didn't reach America. The decision revealed something about Fulcher's foresight, dedication, and a willingness to prepare for possibilities rather than hope they wouldn't occur. Tell me about the shooting, Sullivan prompted. What goes through your mind when you're looking at a Japanese soldier through that 8-power scope? The question was more difficult than it appeared. Fulcher had been avoiding thinking too deeply about the human dimension of his actions, focusing instead on technical aspects and tactical necessities. But Sullivan's question forced him to confront what he had been doing for the past week, taking human lives at distances where his targets were clearly visible as individuals rather than anonymous enemy forces. I try not to think of them as people, Fulcher said slowly. If I start thinking about their families, their lives before the war, whether they're good men or bad men, if I think about any of that, I can't do the job. So I focus on the technical aspects. Distance, wind, bullet drop, target movement. I reduce it to mathematics and physics. Pull the trigger, cycle the bolt, acquire the next target. But you must think about it sometimes. Sullivan pressed, you must wonder about the men you've killed. Fulcher was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. They were calloused from rifle work and scarred from jungle thorns. The hands of someone who had transitioned from peace to war without fully understanding what that transition would cost. I think about it at night, he finally admitted. When I can't sleep, when the adrenaline has worn off. I wonder if the soldier I killed at 0900 hours had a wife waiting for him in Tokyo or Osaka. I wonder if the sniper I killed in that duel in the rain had children who won't see their father again. I wonder if any of them were good men forced into bad circumstances, just like me. Sullivan's pencil paused over his notebook. This was the truth that war correspondents sought but rarely found, the acknowledgement that killing, even justified killing in wartime, left marks on the killer as well as the killed. Do you regret it? He asked. No, Fulcher said immediately. Not if it means Marines go home to their families instead of Japanese soldiers going home to theirs. Not if it means the private I saved on the 8th survives this war and has children of his own. My job is to protect the men I serve with, and if that requires killing enemy soldiers, then that's what I do. But I won't pretend it doesn't affect me. Anyone who can kill another human being without it affecting them is someone you should be afraid of, whether they're wearing our uniform or the enemy's. The interview continued for another hour, ranging across topics from Fulcher's childhood in Virginia to his thoughts on the progress of the war. Sullivan proved to be a skilled interviewer, asking questions that revealed character rather than just collecting facts. When he finally departed, he promised to send Fulcher a copy of whatever article eventually appeared in print. 2 days later, Captain Mitchell called Fulcher to company headquarters. The captain looked unusually formal, and several other officers were present, including a colonel Fulcher didn't recognize. Something important was about to happen, though Fulcher couldn't imagine what. Corporal Fulcher Mitchell began formally. I've been authorized to inform you that you're being awarded the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy forces. Your actions from November 7th through November 11th resulted in 11 confirmed enemy casualties, including enemy snipers and forward observers. Your dedication to duty and exceptional marksmanship have contributed significantly to the success of operations on Buk. The colonel stepped forward, holding a small case containing the medal. Additionally, Corporal, the Marine Corps has taken note of your innovative approach to equipment selection. Effective immediately, we're authorizing a test program for commercial telescopic sights on designated marksman rifles. If the program succeeds, your decision to purchase your own equipment may influence Marine Corps procurement for years to come. Fulcher accepted the medal with quiet dignity, though internally he felt conflicted. Medals were given for killing, yet killing, even necessary killing, didn't feel like something deserving celebration. But he understood the gesture's importance to military morale and organizational culture. The medal wasn't really about him. It was about acknowledging that individual initiative and skill mattered in an increasingly industrialized war. That evening, sitting alone with his rifle, Fulcher thought about Sullivan's questions and his own answers. The war had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The fighting on Bougainville continued for weeks after Fulcher's 4 days of intensive counter-sniper operations, but his role gradually shifted from active shooter to instructor and advisor. The Marine Corps, recognizing the value of his experience and methodology, pulled him from frontline duty to train other designated marksmen in the techniques that had made him so effective. It was a logical decision from a military efficiency standpoint. One experienced sniper could teach dozens of others, multiplying his impact far beyond what he could achieve individually. But Fulcher found the transition difficult. Teaching required a different skill set than shooting, and he struggled to articulate knowledge that had become intuitive through years of practice. How do you explain the feeling of when conditions are right for a difficult shot? How do you teach someone to read wind at 300 yards when wind indicators might be contradictory? How do you convey the psychological discipline required to remain motionless for hours while insects crawl across your skin and sweat pools in your eyes? Private Daniel McCarthy, one of the riflemen who had accompanied Fulcher on the observation post mission, became his first and most dedicated student. McCarthy was a natural marksman from rural Montana who had grown up hunting elk in mountain terrain. He understood the fundamentals of long-range shooting and needed only refinement and tactical application to become an effective military sniper. The scope is a tool for observation first and shooting second, Fulcher explained during one training session, holding up the unertl for emphasis. Most new snipers focus too much on taking shots and not enough on gathering information. You watch enemy positions, you learn their patterns. You identify who the leaders are, where the machine guns are positioned, when they change guard shifts. Only after you've gathered intelligence do you start selecting targets. McCarthy nodded, absorbing the lesson. How do you decide who to shoot first? Officers and NCOs are priority targets. Guilda leaders and units become disorganized. Then specialists, machine gunners, mortar crews, radio operators, regular riflemen are lowest priority unless they pose an immediate threat to our troops. You're not trying to maximize body count, you're trying to maximize tactical impact. This approach to target selection reflected Fulcher's evolving understanding of his role. He wasn't simply a killer. He was a tactical asset whose value lay in eliminating specific threats that posed disproportionate danger to American forces. Every shot needed to serve a larger purpose beyond simply reducing enemy numbers. By early December, the situation on Bougainville had stabilized. American forces controlled the crucial airfield and had established a defensive perimeter that Japanese counterattacks had failed to penetrate. The intense fighting of November had given way to a grinding war of attrition that would continue for months, but the immediate crisis had passed. Fulcher's tally remained at 11 confirmed kills in 4 days, a number that would appear in official records and would eventually become part of Marine Corps sniper lore. Historical accounts compiled after the war, including documents later archived at the Marine Corps History Division, would note that Fulcher's success with commercial equipment influenced a significant shift in military procurement philosophy. The rigid insistence on standardized equipment gave way to recognition that specialized roles sometimes required specialized tools, and that soldiers with expertise should have input into equipment selection. It was a small victory for individual initiative over bureaucratic conformity, but the broader impact of Fulcher's actions extended beyond equipment debates. His story, the young Marine who bought a rifle from a catalog and used it to extraordinary effect, resonated with a public hungry for tales of individual heroism in a war increasingly defined by industrial-scale destruction. Sullivan's article for the Associated Press, published in late November 1943, appeared in newspapers across America, and Fulcher suddenly found himself receiving letters from strangers thanking him for his service and asking technical questions about rifles and scopes. One letter particularly affected him. It came from a widow in Pennsylvania whose husband had been killed at Guadalcanal. She wrote, "I take comfort knowing that Marines like you are protecting the others, preventing more families from receiving the telegram I received. My husband died doing his duty, but perhaps your rifle saved someone else's husband from the same fate. Thank you for that." Fulcher read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his pack. It articulated something he had struggled to express, that his purpose wasn't about killing enemy soldiers but about protecting American ones. The distinction might seem subtle, but it mattered to him psychologically. He was a guardian, not a murderer, and every enemy soldier he killed was one less threat to the Marines he served with. In January 1944, Fulcher received orders transferring him back to the United States. The Marine Corps wanted him to participate in training programs at Camp Pendleton, teaching his techniques to a new generation of scout snipers being prepared for the campaigns that would carry American forces across the Pacific toward Japan. It was a recognition of his value as an instructor, but it also meant leaving the men he had fought beside on Bougainville. His last night on the island, Sergeant Blake organized an informal gathering of the scout sniper section. They sat around a small fire, violating light discipline but not caring, and passed around a bottle of whiskey that Blake had somehow acquired through the mysterious supply channels that existed in every military organization. They told stories, exaggerating their exploits in the way that soldiers always do, and they toasted absent friends who wouldn't be returning home. To Fulcher, Blake said, raising his canteen cup, the only man who ever won an argument with Marine Corps logistics by ordering his rifle from Sears. They drank, and they laughed, and for a brief moment the war seemed distant rather than immediate. But even in that moment of camaraderie, Fulcher felt the weight of what he had done and what he had become. He was 23 years old and had killed at least 11 men. The number might increase in future combat, or it might remain fixed at 11 for the rest of his life. Either way, those deaths would be part of him forever, carried alongside the memories of Virginia Hills and his grandfather's patient teaching and the innocent dreams of a time before war. The next morning, he packed his personal equipment, including the Springfield with its unearthed scope, and boarded a transport aircraft bound for Guadalcanal, then Hawaii, then ultimately California. As the plane climbed away from Bougainville, he looked down at the island where he had proven himself, where his catalog rifle had become legendary, where 11 Japanese soldiers had died at distances they thought were safe. The transport flight to San Diego took 5 days, with stops at various specific bases for refueling and maintenance. Fulcher spent the journey in contemplative silence, watching ocean and islands pass below, thinking about the vast distances that separated the war from home. Somewhere down there, men were still fighting and dying on jungle islands with strange names. But with each mile traveled eastward, that reality became more abstract, easier to mentally file away as something that happened to someone else in some other time. Camp Pendleton in January 1944 bustled with activity as the Marine Corps prepared for the campaigns that would define 1944 and 1945. Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Young Marines fresh from training arrived daily, and Fulcher saw his younger self reflected in their faces, eager, confident, unaware of what combat would actually demand from them. His job was to prepare them as best he could to pass on lessons learned at considerable cost. The sniper school at Pendleton had expanded significantly since Fulcher had passed through it 18 months earlier. The mockery he had endured for bringing his own rifle had been replaced by genuine interest in specialized equipment. Several instructors approached him, requesting to examine his Springfield, asking technical questions about the unertl scope's capabilities and limitations. His catalog rifle had become, improbably, a training aid for the Marine Corps, but teaching proved more difficult than Fulcher anticipated. The students were attentive and motivated, but they lacked the context that made the lessons meaningful. They had never felt a bullet pass inches from their heads, never experienced the terror of knowing a skilled enemy sniper was hunting them, never had to make the decision to take a human life at a distance where the target's face was clearly visible through a scope. Fulcher could teach them the mechanics of long-range shooting, but he couldn't teach them the psychology of combat until they experienced it themselves. One student, a corporal from Texas named William Henderson, asked the question that Fulcher had been dreading. "Sir, what's it feel like to kill someone? Does it get easier?" The classroom fell silent. 30 young Marines waited for an answer that would either reassure them or terrify them, depending on what Fulcher said. He chose his words carefully, aware that this moment might stay with these students longer than any technical instruction. "It doesn't get easier," he said quietly. "Not if you're doing it right. Every time you pull that trigger on a human target, you're making a choice that can't be unmade. The man in your crosshairs might be a decent person who loves his family and was forced into this war just like you were. Or he might be a fanatic who would torture you if he captured you. You can't know which, and it doesn't really matter, because your job is to protect the Marines around you. And if that requires killing enemy soldiers, then that's what you do." He paused, looking at the faces of these young men who would soon be doing exactly what he described. "But don't ever let yourself believe it doesn't matter. Don't become the kind of person who kills without it affecting them. The moment you stop caring about the weight of what you're doing, you've lost something essential that makes you human. You can be a good sniper and still carry the burden of what being a good sniper requires." The silence that followed was profound. Henderson nodded slowly, and Fulcher saw understanding in the young corporal's eyes. These men would go to war carrying not just rifles and ammunition, but also the knowledge that killing, even necessary killing, exacted a price from the killer as well as the killed. Through spring and summer of 1944, Fulcher trained hundreds of Marines in scout sniper techniques. Many of them would go on to fight in the campaigns that brought American forces ever closer to Japan. Some would survive and return home with their own stories and scars. Others would die on beaches and mountains, whose names would become part of American military history. Fulcher couldn't know which students would live and which would die, but he could prepare them as well as possible for what they would face. In August 1944, the Marine Corps officially adopted new guidelines for sniper equipment procurement, allowing designated marksmen to requisition commercial telescopic sights if they could demonstrate superior performance compared to standard-issue equipment. The policy change represented a small but significant victory for individual initiative over bureaucratic standardization. Fulcher's catalog rifle had influenced doctrine after all, though he took little personal satisfaction from this achievement. Policy changes couldn't bring back the men who had died, couldn't undo the killing he had done, couldn't restore the innocence he had carried to war and left behind on Buch. In December 1944, as the war entered its final year, Fulcher received a letter from Private McCarthy, now Sergeant McCarthy, who had been his student on Bougainville. McCarthy wrote about his experiences in the Palau Islands campaign, about putting Fulcher's lessons into practice under combat conditions, about the strange mixture of pride and horror that came with successful sniper work. The letter concluded, "You taught me how to stay alive and how to keep others alive. But you also taught me to remember that the enemy soldiers I kill are human beings. That second lesson might be more important than the first." Fulcher read McCarthy's letter several times, recognizing in it the same moral complexity he himself struggled with. War required killing. But maintaining your humanity while killing required something additional: refusal to become callous, an insistence on carrying the weight rather than pretending it didn't exist. It was an uncomfortable position, neither fully embracing the warrior identity nor rejecting the necessity of violence in defense of others. The war ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Fulcher was still at Camp Pendleton, still teaching, still carrying his Springfield with its unertl scope. He had not fired the rifle in combat since Bougainville, but he had trained hundreds of Marines who had fired their rifles on islands across the Pacific. His impact on the war had been indirect but measurable. Every student he trained who survived and successfully completed their mission was evidence that knowledge could be transmitted, that one person's experience could benefit many others. Demobilization came slowly. The Marine Corps contracted from its wartime peak of nearly 500,000 men to a peacetime force of less than 100,000. Fulcher received his discharge papers in March 1946, along with formal thanks for his service and a suggestion that he might consider making the Marines a career. He declined politely. He had done his duty and done it well, but he was ready to return to civilian life and leave the war behind as much as anyone who had fought in it could ever truly leave it behind. He returned to Virginia, carrying the Springfield rifle that had become famous, at least within Marine Corps circles. The catalog that had once represented innocent recreation now carried different associations: war, death, survival, duty. Fulcher would keep the rifle for the rest of his life, maintaining it with the same meticulous care he had applied during the war, but he would rarely shoot it. Looking through that unearthed scope brought back too many memories of faces seen at 400 yards, of soldiers who had died without knowing what killed them, of the strange intimacy that existed between sniper and target in the moment before the trigger was pulled. Historical records compiled after the war would note that Corporal John George Fulcher had achieved 11 confirmed kills in 4 days during the Bougainville campaign using a personally owned rifle purchased through the Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog. The number 11 would become fixed in official accounts, though Fulcher himself believed the actual total was higher. The chaos of combat made confirmation difficult, and some kills were probable rather than certain. But 11 was the official count, and that number entered Marine Corps history as an example of individual initiative and exceptional marksmanship. What the historical records didn't capture, what numbers and statistics never could, was the human cost of those 11 kills. 11 Japanese soldiers who never returned home. 11 families who received notification that their loved one had fallen in service to the Emperor. 11 individuals reduced to statistics in the vast accounting of war. Fulcher thought about them sometimes in quiet moments, wondering who they had been and whether their deaths had served any purpose beyond the brutal arithmetic of combat. He also thought about the Marines whose lives he had protected, the young private whose death he had prevented by exposing his position, the patrols that had moved safely because he had eliminated enemy snipers watching their routes. If his actions had saved even one American life, then the weight he carried was worth bearing. But that calculation didn't make the weight any lighter. In later years, when people asked him about the war, and people always asked veterans about their wars, Fulcher would tell them about the catalog rifle, about the mockery that turned to respect, about the technical aspects of long-range shooting. He would not tell them about the faces he had seen through his scope, about the dreams that sometimes woke him in the night, about the psychological complexity of being very good at killing people while trying to maintain your humanity. John George Fulcher died in 1998 at the age of 77. His Springfield rifle with its unearthed scope was donated to the National Museum of the Marine Corps, where it remains on display as an artifact of innovation and individual initiative during World War II. Visitors can read the placard explaining how a young Marine bought a rifle from a catalog and used it to achieve 11 confirmed kills in 4 days on Bougainville. The placard doesn't mention the cost Fulcher paid for those kills, the weight he carried for 53 years after the war ended, or the complexity of being remembered as a hero for actions that haunted him. That complexity, the tension between duty and humanity, between necessary killing and the moral weight of killing, between the pride of serving well and the sorrow of what service required, defined not just Fulcher's experience but the experience of countless soldiers throughout history. War demands that we become something other than what we were, and for many, the challenge isn't surviving war, but surviving what war makes us become. The catalog rifle became legend. The man who wielded it became a footnote. Perhaps that's how it should be. Tools are easier to celebrate than the complicated humans who use them. But in remembering John George Fulcher, we should remember not just his marksmanship or his innovation, but his insistence on carrying the moral weight of his actions. In an age that often celebrates warrior prowess while ignoring warrior pain, his story reminds us that the best soldiers are often those most aware of what they have done and what it has cost them. They mocked his mail-order rifle until he killed 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days. But the real story wasn't about the rifle at all. It was about the young man from Virginia who did his duty while refusing to surrender his humanity, who killed when necessary while never forgetting that killing mattered, who survived the war but carried its weight for the rest of his life. That story, more complicated, more honest, more human than any simple tale of military heroism, is the one worth remembering.